doing all this
I'm
stuff.
incredibly grateful, I feel like I'd really be.
The gate was never meant to be a stage. No cameras waited there. No applause echoed between its iron bars. And yet, that quiet entrance became the final boundary of a life the world believed was only just beginning. Anton Yelchin did not die on a film set. He did not collapse under the weight of scandal or excess. He died alone, at dawn, pinned against the gate of his own home as his car rolled forward in silence. An accident so absurd, so cruelly ordinary, that Hollywood itself seemed unprepared to comprehend it. He was 27. Just months earlier, Anton Yelchin stood at the center of a billion-dollar universe. As Pavel Chekhov in Star Trek, he represented the future of a legendary franchise, young, brilliant, endlessly promising. Contracts waited, roles were lining up. Time, it seemed, was finally on his side. But behind the polished image of a rising star, something else was unfolding. Something quieter, something far more urgent. A life lived at full speed. A body that never truly rested. A man who worked as if tomorrow were uncertain. When the news broke, the world asked how it happened. But the deeper question lingered in the silence that followed. Was this only a tragic accident? Or the final moment of a life that had been running out of time for years? Anton Yelchin was born far from Hollywood, far from English dialogue, far from any world that imagined red carpets or studio lights. He entered life in March 1989 in Leningrad, a city still shaped by Soviet shadows, long winters, and unspoken fear. His parents were figure skaters, artists of motion rather than words, people whose bodies had learned discipline before freedom. They loved art, but they also understood survival. And when the old world began to crack, they made a decision that would quietly define their son's entire existence. They left. The journey to the United States was not a heroic escape. It was cautious, uncertain, filled with paperwork, waiting rooms, and the kind of anxiety that lives permanently in immigrant households. Anton arrived in America as a child who did not yet understand loss, but who would soon learn its language fluently. English was foreign. Belonging was conditional. Identity became something he would never fully own, only borrow. In Los Angeles, his family rebuilt from nothing. There was no inherited safety net, no famous last name, no privileged access to studios. At home, Russian was still spoken. Outside, Anton learned quickly that silence could be safer than explanation. He grew into a boy who observed more than he spoke, who listened carefully, who studied people the way other children studied games. Teachers noticed his intelligence. Friends noticed his reserve. What few people noticed was how early he learned to disappear into himself. He was small for his age, slight, not physically imposing. He did not carry the loud confidence that Hollywood often mistakes for charisma. Instead, he had something quieter, focus. When Anton discovered acting, it did not arrive as a dream of fame. It arrived as shelter. Acting gave him structure. Scripts gave him rules. Characters gave him permission to speak without explaining himself. On set, there was a script for everything. Where to stand, when to speak, how long to look into someone's eyes. For a child who felt permanently misaligned with the world around him, this order felt comforting. Acting was not an escape from reality. It was a way to survive it. By the time he reached his early teens, Anton was already working steadily. Small roles, supporting parts, independent films. Nothing glamorous, nothing headline-worthy. He was not a child star in the traditional sense. There were no tabloid stories, no manufactured personas, no early adoration. Instead, there was work, long days, quiet professionalism. Directors began to notice something unusual. This young actor did not perform at the camera. He seemed to exist inside the moment. As he grew older, Anton did not rebel in the way Hollywood often romanticizes. There were no public breakdowns, no wild years, no visible attempts to burn through life quickly. If anything, he became more controlled, more inward. He read constantly. He listened to classical music. He played guitar. He absorbed art with the intensity of someone who sensed, without yet understanding why, that time mattered. High school passed without spectacle. College was never his focus. The industry already had its hooks in him, gently but firmly. Yet even as his resume grew, Anton remained oddly invisible. He was praised, respected, admired by critics, but rarely celebrated. He existed in that narrow space between recognition and anonymity, where talent is obvious, but fame is not guaranteed. That space shaped him. In his late teens and early 20s, Anton gravitated toward roles that mirrored his inner world. Outsiders, observers, young men standing just slightly apart from everyone else. He was drawn to independent cinema not because it was prestigious, but because it allowed silence, long pauses, unanswered questions, emotional restraint. These films did not ask him to perform confidence. They asked him to be honest. Then came the audition that would quietly change everything. When he was cast as Pavel Chekhov in Star Trek, it did not feel like a coronation. It felt like responsibility. The franchise carried decades of legacy, millions of devoted fans, and the weight of expectation. Chekhov was not merely a character. He was a symbol of youth, optimism, and continuity. Anton understood this instinctively. He approached the role not with ego, but with reverence. Suddenly, the world knew his face. Press tours followed. Red carpets, interviews, global premieres. His name was now attached to a billion-dollar machine. He was no longer just an actor. He was part of a cinematic universe designed to last decades. To many, this was the beginning of everything. To Anton, it felt more complicated. Fame did not transform him. It did not inflate his personality or alter his habits. If anything, it made him more cautious, more guarded. He smiled when expected, spoke thoughtfully, deflected attention toward the work rather than himself. Those close to him noticed that while his schedule grew more demanding, then his private life grew smaller. Behind the scenes, Anton worked relentlessly. Film after film, often overlapping shoots, independent projects squeezed between blockbuster commitments. He rarely said no, not because he was greedy, but because he seemed driven by something deeper than ambition. There was urgency in his choices, though he never named it. He treated time as something fragile, something not to be wasted. Colleagues described him as kind, prepared, intensely present. He arrived early. He learned lines meticulously. He asked questions not to impress, but to understand. On set, he was calm, focused, almost ascetic. He did not behave like someone intoxicated by success. He behaved like someone racing against an invisible clock. To the public, Anton Yelchin was a rising star. Young, gifted, he's seemingly untouched by the darkness that often consumes Hollywood's brightest talents. There were no scandals to dissect, no demons to speculate about. His life appeared clean, orderly, almost modest. But that appearance was misleading. Beneath the structure, beneath the discipline, beneath the carefully managed public image, Anton carried a private burden that shaped every decision he made. A burden that explained his relentless pace, his refusal to slow down, his resistance to rest. A burden he never allowed the world to see. And as his career expanded, contracts signed years in advance, expectations multiplying. The distance between who he was publicly and what he endured privately grew wider. He had achieved what so many dream of: recognition, respect, a place in cinematic history. Yet even as he stood on global stages, there was something unresolved in his eyes. Not sadness, not fear. Something closer to concentration, as if he were constantly listening for a sound only he could hear. The life of Anton Yelchin was unfolding exactly as success stories are supposed to. Step by step, role by role, achievement by achievement. And yet, unseen by the audience, another story was unfolding alongside it. One that would soon redefine everything the world thought it knew about him. For most of his life, Anton Yelchin carried his greatest battle in silence. It was not a struggle that showed itself on red carpets or in interviews. It did not announce itself with visible scars or dramatic confessions. Instead, it lived quietly inside his body, shaping his days, dictating his discipline, and forcing him into a private negotiation with time itself. Anton Yelchin had been living with cystic fibrosis since infancy, a genetic disease that slowly erodes the lungs, taxes the immune system, and turns each breath into a calculation. It was a diagnosis most people learned to fear. Anton learned to hide it. Very few people knew. Fewer still understood what it meant. Cystic fibrosis is not cinematic. It does not arrive in sudden collapse or public crisis. It works patiently, relentlessly, stealing strength in increments so small they are easy to ignore. Until they are not. For Anton, this meant a life governed by routines the world never saw. Medications, treatments, physical limits negotiated daily. It meant fatigue masked as professionalism, pain reframed as discipline, weakness transformed into control. He did not speak about it because he refused to be defined by it. He did not slow down because slowing down felt like surrender. Instead, he worked, film after film, schedule after schedule. He accepted roles others might have postponed. He filled the spaces between blockbusters with independent projects, smaller stories, quieter films that demanded emotional presence even when his body resisted. Colleagues admired his commitment, unaware that what looked like ambition was, in part, defiance. Time was never an abstract concept for Anton Yelchin. It was tangible, measurable, finite. Those close to him noticed patterns they could not explain at the time. He rarely complained. He rarely rested. He treated opportunity as something fragile, almost perishable. While others spoke about future decades in the industry, Anton spoke about work as if it existed only in the present tense. There was urgency in him, but not panic. Determination without dramatics. He was running, but not from fame and not toward excess. He was running against the quiet mathematics of his own body. By 27, Anton had already completed a body of work many actors never reach in a lifetime. He had become part of a legendary franchise. He had earned the respect of directors, critics, and peers. He had proven that he was not a novelty, not a lucky casting choice, but a serious actor with depth. From the outside, his life appeared stable, grounded, controlled. And then came the morning that shattered the illusion of order. It was early, quiet, ordinary in the way tragedies often are. Anton returned to his Los Angeles home after a late rehearsal. There was no party, no celebration, no sign that this day would matter more than any other. He parked his Jeep Grand Cherokee in the driveway outside his house, a routine he had performed countless times before. What happened next took seconds. The vehicle, equipped with a gear shifter later criticized for its confusing design, began to roll forward. Whether the car was fully in park or not would become a matter of investigation, but the outcome was brutally simple. The SUV moved. Anton was caught between the car and the gate pillar. There was no dramatic crash, no explosion, just pressure, silence, wait. No one saw it happen. By the time he was found, the future had already ended. The news spread rapidly, but comprehension lagged behind. Fans struggled to process the details. Journalists repeated the facts with visible disbelief. An actor, young and healthy in appearance, crushed by his own car in his own driveway. And it sounded unreal. Too mundane to be tragic, too absurd to be true. Hollywood paused. Tributes flooded in, not from publicists or distant admirers, but from colleagues who spoke of kindness, humility, and professionalism. Directors remembered his focus. Cast members remembered his gentleness. Friends remembered a man who listened more than he spoke. There were no revelations of chaos, no hidden vices uncovered in the aftermath. Only confusion and grief. As the investigation unfolded, attention turned briefly toward accountability, vehicle design, recalls, responsibility. But for those who knew Anton, these questions felt secondary. The deeper tragedy was not mechanical failure. It was finality, because the truth that emerged after his death recontextualized everything. The world learned what Anton had never publicized: the cystic fibrosis, the lifelong condition, the quiet endurance. Suddenly, his pace made sense. His discipline, his refusal to slow down, his intensity. What had seemed like admirable work ethic now revealed itself as something closer to urgency, perhaps even preparation. He had lived as though time were not guaranteed. And then time proved him right. The tragedy of Anton Yelchin does not rest solely in the manner of his death. It rests in the collision between two realities: a life built on control and an ending defined by randomness. He did everything right. He avoided excess. He respected the craft. He protected his privacy. He worked tirelessly. And yet, none of it shielded him from a moment he could not anticipate. In that sense, his story is not just about loss, and it is about vulnerability. Hollywood often frames tragedy as consequence of addiction, of recklessness, of ambition unchecked. Anton Yelchin's death defied that narrative. There was no moral lesson to extract, no cautionary tale to simplify. Only a reminder that fragility does not discriminate between the careful and the careless. For those left behind, the grief was compounded by unanswered questions. What roles would he have played? What stories would he have told? How might his artistry have matured? These questions linger not because they are productive, but because they are unavoidable. His absence created a vacuum that cannot be filled by speculation. He had been living with loss long before the world lost him: loss of breath, loss of ease, loss of certainty. And yet, he never allowed that loss to define his public identity. He chose dignity over disclosure, work over explanation, presence over pity. The final cruelty is that when the world finally learned what he had been carrying, it was too late to acknowledge his strength in real time. Anton Yelchin did not die as a symbol. He died as a human being, complex, disciplined, private, and quietly brave. His life was not cut short because he was reckless or broken. It ended because existence itself is indifferent to intention. The tragedy, then, is not just that he died young. It is that he lived knowing time was fragile and still lost it without warning. After the noise faded, after the headlines learned how to move on, what remained of Anton Yelchin was not a scandal, not a mystery to be solved, and not a lesson easily summarized. What remained was absence, quiet, persistent, and deeply human. The kind of absence that rearranges a room without moving a single object. Hollywood, a city trained to metabolize loss at high speed, did something unusual in the wake of his death. It slowed. Colleagues did not speak of box office numbers or unrealized contracts. They spoke of character, of gentleness, of preparation, of a young man who listened with his whole body. The industry remembered him not for what he promised to become, but for how he already behaved, as if excellence were a form of respect. There were no exposés to publish, no hidden addictions to unpack, no moral arc to impose. The story resisted simplification, and in that resistance, it became more powerful. Anton's legacy does not live in award ceremonies or retrospective montages alone. It lives in the way his performances continue to breathe, subtle, attentive, unforced. Watch him closely and you see it. The restraint, the listening, the refusal to dominate a scene. He acted as though the camera were not something to conquer, but something to trust. That trust remains palpable, even now, even in silence. In the years since his passing, viewers have returned to his work with altered eyes. Scenes once read as quiet now feel deliberate. Pauses once dismissed as shyness now register as intention. There is a sense, impossible to prove but difficult to ignore, that he was always speaking in a lower register, one that required patience from the audience. And patience, in the modern world, is rare. His life outside the screen has been remembered with similar clarity. Friends describe a man who avoided spectacle, who gave without documenting it, Tharks who treated success as responsibility rather than entitlement. He did not collect luxury as proof of arrival. He collected books, music, conversations. He lived as though accumulation were less important than alignment. Perhaps that is why his story hurts the way it does. We are conditioned to accept tragic endings when they follow excess, when brilliance burns itself out. Anton Yelchin offers no such comfort. There is no narrative release in believing he lived too fast. He did not. He lived deliberately, carefully, with discipline that bordered on devotion. And yet, none of that granted immunity. This is where the reflection deepens, and where the story stops being about Hollywood at all. Anton's life asks an uncomfortable question. What if doing everything right does not guarantee safety? What if dignity does not protect us from randomness? What if time, no matter how respectfully treated, remains indifferent to our plans? These questions are not philosophical exercises. They are human ones. They surface in the quiet hours after loss, when meaning feels provisional and explanations feel thin. Anton Yelchin's story does not answer them. It simply refuses to lie about them. And in that refusal, there is a strange form of grace. He lived with a body that demanded vigilance, with a condition that required constant negotiation. He could have chosen bitterness, withdrawal, or spectacle. He chose work. He chose presence. He chose to give more than he took. These choices did not extend his life, but they deepened it. That distinction matters. In the years following his death, his parents established foundations in his name, on supporting causes he believed in quietly, without announcement. His memory has been carried forward not through branding, but through continuation, through action that mirrors his values rather than exploits his absence. Even in death, his influence resists grandiosity. There is something profoundly instructive in that. We live in a culture obsessed with optimization, more productivity, more longevity, more control. Anton Yelchin's life disrupts that fantasy. It suggests that meaning is not found in outlasting time, but in honoring it, not in squeezing life for maximum output, but in showing up fully, even when the future is uncertain. His story also reframes courage. Courage, in his case, was not loud. It did not announce itself. It did not demand recognition. It lived in routine, in consistency, in choosing to work through pain without turning pain into identity, in refusing to let illness become narrative currency. That kind of courage rarely trends. It rarely goes viral. But it endures. As viewers, we are left with something quieter than inspiration. We are left with responsibility. The responsibility to look again at how we measure success, how we interpret silence, how quickly we assume we understand the lives unfolding in front of us. Anton Yelchin reminds us that the most disciplined people are often the most tired, that the calmest rooms may hold the heaviest weight. And perhaps most importantly, his story asks us to be gentler with others and with ourselves. If a young man who lived with urgency, integrity, and restraint could still be taken without warning, then urgency alone is not the answer. Control is not the answer. Perfection is not the answer. Presence is. Anton Yelchin was present in his work, in his relationships, in the moments he chose not to explain himself. That presence did not save him, but it saved something else. It saved his dignity. It saved the sincerity of his craft. It saved the humanity of his memory. In the end, that may be the only kind of permanence available to any of us. So if there is a message to carry forward from his life, it is not a warning. It is an invitation. Slow down, not because time is guaranteed, but because it is not. Listen more than you speak, not because silence is empty, but because it is full. Work with care, not because success will protect you, but because care is its own reward. And if you ever feel yourself running as though tomorrow might not wait, pause. Some gates are not meant to be crossed in silence. Some lives are not measured by how long they last, but by how deeply they are lived.